Do Catholics have good reason to believe their God is real? A book by Edward Fesser claims they do, and this article I found agrees. So what does reality say? Let's have a look. There's a website out there called Denver Catholic, and I found this article about a book by Edward Fesser called 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, based around that old Catholic idol, Thomas Aquinas, who I've debunked on numerous occasions. But, as should be no surprise, the Catholics never learn, because they're not interested in reality. They're only out to validate their pre-existing beliefs so that the faithful will keep believing it. That's a pretty piss-poor reason to write books, sorry to say. So let's see what this article says, and why none of it is at all impressive. If someone asked you if you could prove that God exists, what would you say? Well, I'd say, sorry, I can't because I know how proof works, and I know that the religious have nothing remotely resembling objective evidence for their claims. I know I couldn't do it. And I know you can't do it either. What would you have to draw upon to answer this question? Revelation, science, or philosophy? Well, of those 3 choices, only one actually works, and that one doesn't provide any insight or evidence into the existence of any gods, period. Revelation is just rationalization. It is the belief that something happened to you because of a god, yet there's no way to test whether or not that's true. And as I've said in the past, philosophy is useless for determining what is real in factual reality. You can't discover a new species of animal through philosophical means, thus you can't find out anything about a real God that way. So we're back to science, and science doesn't support the existence of any God. So I guess the religious are just screwed. Revelation gives us knowledge of God as a free gift and does not require us to prove his contents, but to understand them with the help of the church. Except it doesn't. This is just a bald assertion invented by the religious, which cannot be backed up in any objectively verifiable way. And it's interesting how they say that it requires the church to tell people what the supposed revelation means. That casts the church, specifically the Catholic Church in this case, as the gatekeeper to all knowledge regarding God. I mean, that sounds remarkably cult-like, doesn't it? Because the church, any church, has no more demonstrable and verifiable experience with actual gods than anyone else. They're just out to make money and influence people, and this is their method to maintain control. Interesting how so few people notice that, isn't it? Science cannot prove God's existence because God is not an object of empirical study that can be measured with earthly means. No, science can't prove God's existence because there's no reason to think God is real. If God was real, then we could prove it. God has simply been defined as immeasurable because the religious know, or at least rationalize on some level, that God isn't really there, so they invent nonsensical boundaries to prevent science from saying, hey, you're all a bunch of idiots. And finally, this leaves us the option of philosophy, making arguments of reason based upon the nature of things and the dynamics of causality. Yet, as I said, philosophy says nothing demonstrable about reality. You can make philosophical arguments about unicorns and leprechauns that are just like all of the ones made for God. That doesn't prove unicorns and leprechauns are real. So of the 3 options, one is complete nonsense, one is being horribly misused for something that it was never intended to do, and the third finds no reason at all to take these claims of God seriously. Sorry, if any of this is supposed to be impressive, I'm just not seeing it. Thomas Aquinas makes an important distinction about proving God's existence through reason. We can know naturally that God exists, that there's an infinite and perfect being who created the universe, but we cannot know who God is by reason alone. You can't use reason at all to understand God, which is a surefire sign that God isn't actually real, just invented for emotional comfort by a bunch of irrational idiots who can't deal with the real world. And this is the real problem behind religion, because religious practitioners simply can't see the truth in that. Nonetheless, knowing that God exists does help the mind a great deal, recognizing its natural dependence on the Creator and removing a major obstacle in coming to faith. Except that you haven't actually discovered knowledge that God exists, only the desire for a God of some kind, and then for your particular God to exist, such that you interpret anything as a sign that your imaginary friend is real, whether you have a good reason to think that or not. But the writer here does note the truth, which I think is kind of amazing, that knowing, or in reality blindly believing, in some all-powerful father figure in the sky that watches over you helps the weak-willed and weak-minded a lot. But that doesn't make it true. It doesn't make any of it true. Just because it feels good doesn't mean it's real. And for skeptics who care more about reality than feelings, it doesn't matter how many times we point this out, the religious just don't want to hear it. And that's why they fail so spectacularly. Now, I'm going to skip ahead through all of the non-Aquinas stuff here, because that's really what the article is about. The Thomistic proof begins with the real distinction in each of the things of our experience between its essence and its existence, and argues that the ultimate cause of such things must be something which is subsistent existence itself. Except none of that is demonstrable. It's all bald assertion and rationalization. Now, you have to remember that back in the day of Aquinas, he had no idea how the brain worked. People assumed things about reality which have since been proven entirely wrong. And this is what happens when your most significant thinkers died 800 years ago. You never improve because you're stuck in the distant past. That's why the Catholic Church hasn't gotten any better, because all of their thinking is based on demonstrably wrong ideas. Tradition doesn't automatically make truth, no matter how comforting that tradition might happen to be. It all has to be continually tested and improved to have any objectively valid meaning. And that's not how religion operates, unfortunately. It's why Aquinas' 5 proofs are so utterly laughable. I've done refutations on them in the past, and they simply do not stand up to any rational, critical evaluation. Fesser, who's the guy who wrote the book they're pushing, makes it clear that the book is not a study in the history of philosophy. His arguments refer to key elements of the thought of each of the 5 thinkers, but he actively constructs a compelling argument that stands on its own terms today. Except they don't. Not one bit. That's the problem of starting with a conclusion that you desperately want to reach, whether it's real or not, then constructing a rickety system of ad hoc rationalizations and blind faith in order to get there. As anyone who's seen any of my videos on standard religious philosophical arguments, you know that they almost always start with a series of carefully curated but utterly piss-poor premises, things that cannot be rationally justified in any way. Then they wave their hands and spout nonsense to come up with, "Therefore God exists." Except none of the claims actually survive skeptical muster. And as with Aquinas, most of these supposed proofs have been around for a very, very long time, and they haven't significantly evolved since. And that's because they're based on faith, not fact. They haven't adapted to modern scientific discoveries and new observations and understandings about the world. They just reside in the darkness of the past, pretending they have any rational validity. I mean, Aquinas himself relied mostly on the views of the ancients, even more ancient than he was, most specifically Aristotle. But our understanding of the real world has come a long way since then, And a lot of the things that Aristotle thought, and because his ideas were based on Aristotle, Aquinas thought, are simply wrong. Yet the Catholics still cling to it because tradition is all they care about, and feelings are all that matter. Fesser's book, which granted I haven't read, but I'm assuming simply continues to push that narrative, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong. He also spends a considerable amount of time engaging opposing views and objections raised by atheists, both throughout the book and in an entire chapter to conclude the book. The book is not written in scholarly language, but will provide a challenging read. Ultimately, it provides another way of forming our minds in faith. It might be worth taking a look just for that part, but I'm sure he's just doing what all apologists do, ponying up straw man arguments that they assume atheists would make without actually running it by any real atheists, then addressing the straw man in a patronizing and ultimately irrational manner. In fact, I've got to take a look at this thing. I just popped over to Amazon and ordered the book. I'll see what it actually does when I get around to reading it, which hopefully I'll do by the time this video posts. But again, the article ends with, it provides another way of forming our minds in faith. Not in fact, not with evidence, in faith. Because none of this is, as usual, about proving that God is real. It's about reinforcing the already existing blind faith of the religious with ad hoc rationalizations that they can cling to and feel that their faith is grounded. Except it's not. These books are, pretty much without exception, at least in my experience, aimed at the ignorant layperson who doesn't know any better and isn't likely to go find out. That's why Fesser's book is not written in scholarly language, because it's not aimed at scholars. Ultimately, the Catholic Church knows no more about its mythology than any other religious group does. It assumes that what it professes is true without evidence, without rationality, because it appeals to their emotional state. It's been going on forever because it's a hallmark of all religious belief. But as we've learned more, as we've become more rational and more intelligent, as we've begun to care more about evidence and reason and critical thinking, going back to look at the religious arguments for the existence of their gods, we find that they simply do not stand up to a moment's rational evaluation. That's why these arguments aren't evidence intended to convince skeptics. They're bald rationalizations intended to comfort the already faithful. They are based on absurdly irrational claims formed around pre-existing beliefs meant to reach a conclusion that cannot be intellectually justified because people really want it to be true because it makes them feel good. And that's not a good reason to make an argument, and it's certainly not an intelligent way to form one. But that's the religious. It's why so many people are rejecting religion today, because religion just makes no sense. And for people who are raised understanding the scientific method and rational evaluation, it takes no more than a few moments reading the claims of the religious to see just how absurd it all really is. That's why they're failing. It's one of the many reasons the Catholic Church is falling apart in the West. Not only are they not able to keep their hands out of the cookie jar, but their beliefs are just stupid. And so long as that's true, more and more people, educated, rational people, will continue to walk away. Because Catholics have no clue if their God exists, and really, they just don't care.